So with that, we move back into the first wave of feminism, which was indeed supported by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, with the NAWSA, now being led by Carrie Chapman Catt here, featured on the right. She wanted to focus all of their attention on women's right to vote. She came from sort of she took over for the older generation of women suffragettes, like Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and sort of separate group from them becomes the National Women's Party, which we'll talk about shortly. Carrie Chapman Catt took over from these women, began to age, lobbying each state individually to support the cause. And this group is really at the core to get approval and gain women's suffrage. Now, what we do see also is that there is an opposition to women's suffrage, and groups like the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, what a great name, working to try to get women to stay in the homes, to stay taking care of the children, and to not be allowed to vote. And so what we see is sort of these crazy series of cartoons, of propaganda, of postcards encouraging women not to vote. So we talked about Emmeline Pankhurst in Mary Poppins. Here she is on the left, and here she is featured on the right, supposed to look very emasculated, and they always sort of made suffragettes look hideous in all sort of negative cartoons. The man, don't you wish you were a man, Mrs. Spankhurst? The suffragette, yes, don't you wish you were? So sort of the emasculation of women as well as, the emasculation of men with women looking horrifically ugly. And you see sort of these like bucktooth faces, like this anti-suffragette postcard, calling them plain, to describe them as sort of ugly and unattractive, and that they're old maids, that nobody wants to marry them, and that's the kind of women who are working for the vote. Or like Wild Rose. You also have that you're going to be beaten by your wife if you allow them to vote, or sort of, what would you say, putting them in the crate to try to get sort of violent punishment for suffragettes with her witch-like teeth and hair. Here are some more images. Women beating men as well as the police is kind of a popular storyline. You have this famous poem about the masculine woman. She is mannish from shoes to her hat, coat, collars, and stiff shirt and cravat. She'd wear pants in the street to make her complete, but she knows the law won't stand for that. You also have this being passed on to children, and so we have anti-suffragette cartoons saying that that children will suffer. Here you have young girls beating men, and babies crying because their mothers have gone off to vote. You have the development of the suffragette, right? At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. You have sort of massive images commissioned for Puck magazine in 1908 showing liberated women of the future that were fashionably dressed women smoking cigars, ignoring children, drinking, and gambling. So here you have them all lined up on the bar. As well as this woman ignoring her children. And the caption reads, why not go the limit for the benefit of those ladies who ask for the right to smoke in public? And again, this woman is kind of ignoring her children and smoking and kind of looking disdainfully at them. And of course, the fact that as women enter into professions, children and the home will suffer, and so inherently men will suffer. Like after a hard day's work, you come home to your children being a mess. So the National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage encourages you to join. You have men being shown as Madonnas. Everybody works but mother. She's a suffragette. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. He's stuck at home cleaning the clothes. And also casting them as sort of loose women. Suffragettes know how to get their votes. Election day, the man is stuck at home. There's often sort of the suffragette mixed with suffering. What is a suffragette without a suffering household? And of course, sort of these ridiculous things, like men sort of suffering from women and their suffrage. And then they even had these sort of encouragement of these devices to make women be quiet, which is maybe sort of the most graphic thing that I find about any of these cartoons, honestly. My favorite, of course, being that girls are going to do all of the jobs now, which is hilarious. Like, that's the problem. So we do have the development of a separate party from the N. I'm gonna remember this acronym. NAWSA to the National Women's Party, which is developed in 1913. The development of this group starts with the election of Woodrow Wilson. And on the eve of his inauguration in 1913, there was a massive suffrage parade where hundreds of women were injured and arrested. And this is where the official program for that procession. But it's supposed to stir up this idea of suffrage, encouraging Woodrow Wilson to support women's suffrage and women as sort of participants in the government. And part of this procession, Alice Paul gets up and speaks at this procession. She's here on the right. And Carrie Chapman Catt stood up and criticized her, saying that she was acting like she had more participation in the movement than all other women, which was not Alice Paul's intention, but it caused Paul to separate from the NAWSA and to make this separate group. It's very interestingly cataloged in Iron Jawed Angels, which is a great film featuring Hilary Swank as Alice Paul. Released in 2004, and it's on HBO Go Max. It used to be on YouTube, sadly enough. But I'm going to show you here a quick clip where you have this very sort of 1 minute monologue by Alice Paul, played by Hilary Swank.
Negro men have been voting since the Civil War. You think the ballots changed his life? It's a cash and carry country. What's a vote going to buy you?
Self-respect, for starters.
I vote and I have no self-respect. What do you think women are going to do when they vote? Reform politics?
Because we're morally superior? That's a nice fairy tale. I don't have any illusions about women. There's good and bad, just like men. I don't know what they're going to do with their vote, and I don't care.
Prohibition. Legalized birth control?
It doesn't matter. That's not the point.
What's the point?
We're legitimate citizens. We're taxed without representation. We're not allowed to serve on juries, so we're not tried by our peers. It's unconscionable, not to mention unconstitutional. We don't make the laws, but we have to obey them like children. You know the suffrage amendment has only once been voted on in the Senate, but we've got 9 states now. That's 4 million women voters, which means 1/5 of the House, 1/6 of the Senate, and 1/7 of the electoral votes come from suffrage states. You want to know what women can buy with that?
Were you the smartest girl in your class?
So you have Patrick Dempsey kind of being a jerk, but this great moment where he's asking her what women are really going to do with the vote, and she says it doesn't matter, right? They deserve representation. So we have these great protests by Alice Paul, and really how Alice Paul's group, the National Women's Party, is different from the NAWSA is that they're very much working to be visible and fighting sort of Woodrow Wilson and the government to pass the 19th Amendment by being sort of out in public protesting. So this is one here that, this is Alice Paul, with poster challenging Woodrow Wilson's hypocrisy in being alarmed at Germans' lack of freedom while overlooking women citizens' lack of freedom in his own country. Kaiser meaning emperor. And it comes to a head with the Silent Sentinels in January of 1917 to June of 1919. And this is a group, this is where the National Women's Party is protesting outside of the White House every day silently. And they picket there in no matter sort of what weather for about 2 years, on and off here. Obviously, they didn't all stand out there for 2 years. But it is tolerated until the U.S. declares war in 1917, and they still stood out there regardless. And people sort of felt that it was maybe a little undemocratic, that they were protesting during a war. Now, as a fun fact, this area of the White House has long been a place where people have come to protest, such as this protest here by the Silent Sentinels. But because of Black Lives Matter protests, 2020, they built an even taller fence on the north side of the White House. And even right now, you can't even get to where that fence is. So, and this was on 7/26 of 20. So you have this phenomenally famous group and all these other protests that are very famous outside of the walls of the White House, very close to where the president is. And it's sort of, this area for protests has been sort of restricted currently in the area of protests for Black Lives Matter. So, with this also occurring with, this is what the north side used to look like, used to have this, this shorter fence. And also this being true, as well for the White House. This is what the south side used to look like, where you'd have this gate as well. And now it has this wall because of, the protests for Black Lives Matter. So this very particularly famous area for protests, especially for the suffrage movement, is being blocked out right now for Black Lives Matter. So you can sort of take from that what you will. So in 1919, because of the unrest, because of the United States going into World War I, the police decide to arrest these women suffragettes outside of the White House for quote unquote obstructing traffic. People were insanely appalled, actually, that these women were arrested for peaceful protesting. Surprise, surprise. And many of them were tried to pardon them. Woodrow Wilson was very sort of shocked. And women, including Alice Paul, really sort of fought to stay there for the 7 months, which is kind of insane. But because they wanted to protest the treatment of women and also to sort of gain attention for the suffragette movement. And so what ends up happening is Alice Paul and these women who are arrested and placed in this work camp as well as jail have to suffer with poor sanitation, with beatings, with infested food. And Alice Paul and Lucy Barnes end up going on hunger strikes. And this crazy event, that's something that was really kind of popularized more, I would say, in the 20th century, early 20th century, I hopefully will say, hopefully this will never be true otherwise. But as they worked to be on hunger strike for women's suffrage, people who were part of the jail there, the prison guards, etc., were told that they had to keep Alice Paul and these women alive, that they would suffer even harsher at the hands of the public if they did not keep them alive. And so what really ends up happening is that Alice Paul, especially, but also Lucy Barnes, are force-fed. So they put tubes down their throats and fed them raw eggs and other substances that would fatten them up and sort of keep them alive, which was ridiculous. Alice Paul said that this never was healed, that she never recovered from these injuries of her throat, actually being scraped by this pole that they put down their throats to force feed them. And so here's another comic of it. If you want to call it a comic, ICWT, meaning in chaos we trust. And people are shocked that once this comes out, it is insane. People are outraged that these women who were not supposed to even be arrested in the first place for peacefully protesting stayed there for 7 months. They were tortured. They were treated like prisoners, who committed some heinous crime. And thus it really started to change the mind of people, including very famous women like, there was a senator's wife here, Emily Layton, who even came out and protested so that these women should be released and pardoned immediately. So Alice Paul is released, and when she is asked she's released in 1918. She's asked about her hunger strike and being force-fed. She tells American Heritage, "Seems almost unthinkable now, doesn't it? It was shocking that a government of men could look with such extreme contempt on a movement that was asking nothing except such a simple little thing as the right to vote." Because of this happening, Woodrow Wilson finally states in 1918, in the same year that Alice Paul and the other suffragettes are released from jail, he states, "I regard the extension of suffrage to women as vitally essential to the successful prosecution of the great war of humanity in which we are engaged." So it comes down to a vote, and we have women fighting as Wilson starts to support this amendment. And you have those who supported it, like I said before, wearing the yellow rose and the red rose, being for those against women's suffrage. And ironically enough, the vote comes down to a 23-year-old who was named Harry T. Byrne, and he was opposed to the amendment. People are working hard to make sure that he does not vote for women's rights. And he receives a letter from his mother, who's here on the right. And she states, "Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but you have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cap put the rat in ratification." And so, sort of out of fear of his mother, he does indeed vote for this amendment. And so the 19th Amendment is passed because of Harry T. Byrne, and a letter from his mother. I guess really from his mother. So, thankfully, in August 18th of 1920, we have the passing of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Such as good old Susan B. Anthony. So the characteristics of the first wave we have seen so far is that women have gained civil rights as full citizens with the right to vote, equal access to education and healthcare, and the right to enter and practice in professions in the public sphere, making oppression visible and questioned arguments that oppression was justified by God or nature, and women working outside the home during World War I and World War II as well. And where we're really going to see limitations, we're going to focus on next week in sort of the second part of this, which is while women who gained the right to vote in 1920, they were white, middle, and upper class with leisure time and education. First wave feminists often base their arguments on the beliefs that because women were mothers, they were naturally more nurturing, kind, and moral, and would therefore make better leaders and politicians than men. And, of course, Black women were not allowed to participate, and men are kept from voting through force. Black men, that is, through the KKK and other white supremacist groups. So we're going to talk about that second half next week, just because this is a lot of information as it is. I wanted to kind of combine it, but it got to be too much. So I'm going to separate them. But as I said previously, you really have kind of women's suffrage and abolitionist movements starting with Black women, and we're going to kind of hopefully end on a high note for Black women as well. With everything going on and Ruth Bader Ginsburg passing away this week, I wanted to play a clip by her, which is really phenomenal, and I just heard it today or the day before, which is this very, very short, fast quote by her.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
A belle of the law, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is the
which really shook me a little bit. A phenomenal voter for sort of female rights through the years. So next week we will be focusing on this part 2, which is talking about suffrage for Black females, post-ratification of 19th Amendment, along with voting rights for Black men as well. And then we'll look at some proto-feminist artists. Remember, there is no homework for this week, but be working on your research proposal. I don't think that we've talked about this extensively. I'll be posting a video about it shortly. But I was going to show it right now, but that's fine. But we will be looking at this, and you do have to sort of claim a feminist artist to look at. And so I will probably post a video about sort of how to go about that, but be thinking about who you want to research for this week, along with doing the lectures. I guess I said no homework, but you do have a small discussion assignment, in which you kind of talk to each other about this, just so that you're continuing to engage with these ideas. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys all next week.